Right, we're on to topic number 2, which is looking at numbers. And this is still going to be useful for your IAs because you will need to be able to round numbers or to put numbers to certain decimal places or significant figures correctly. But it's also going to be useful for your exam because you may be asked to round, you may be asked to approximate. And also all answers in the exam should be given to 3 significant figures. So it's important that we understand what significant figures are. So I've got 2 different tasks for you. The first one is looking at the yellow box, and I'd like you to take each of these numbers here. I'd like you to round all of them to the nearest 10, round all of them to the nearest 100, and then round all of them to the nearest 1000. In the orange box, I'd like you to look at these 3 numbers, and I'd like you to say first of all how many decimal places they've been rounded to, and then how many significant figures they've been rounded to. So pause the video here and answer these questions, please. Okay, so in this case, this first number here, if we're going to round it to the nearest 10, we would be looking at making the number a multiple of 10. Well, at the moment, it's not a multiple of 10 because it's got 44 at the end, so it can't be a multiple of 10. To be a multiple of 10, it needs to have 1 0 at the end. So we're deciding whether to round this final part here of 17,644, whether we're going to round it up to 650, or whether we're going to round it down to 640. And the important part of our decision here is going to be this number here. If this number is less than 5, we're going to round down. If it's more than 5 or equal to 5, we're going to round up. Well, in this case, it's 4, so it's less than 5. So in that case, we would round down. So it should become 17640. This number here, again, we're trying to make it a multiple of 10, so there needs to be a 0 at the end. So we're deciding whether to round this up to 700 or whether to round it down to 690. Well, this number here is 5 or above, so we need to round up, so it's going to be 88,700. This final number here you shouldn't have had to do anything to because it is in fact a multiple of 10. You can tell because it's got a 0 at the end. To the nearest 100, well, let's have a look at this one. So this value here is what we're looking at. We're trying to have 2 zeros at the end to make it a multiple of 100. So we're either going to round down to 17,600 or we're going to round up to 17,700. So now, because I'm thinking about hundreds, and this is the hundreds value here, I look at the value before and I decide, is it less than 5 or is it more than 5? Or in this case, is it less than 50 or is it more than 50? Well, here it's less than 50, so I'm going to round down and I get 17,600. Here it's more than 50, so I'm going to round up and I'm going to get 88,700. This final one here has got 2 zeros at the end, so you shouldn't have changed the number at all. Okay, and finally to the nearest 1,000, so it needs to have 3 zeros at the end. So all of these values here are going to become 0. So I'm deciding whether I'm going to have 17,000 or 18,000. Well, in this case, I'm looking here and I'm thinking, right, this number here, it is more than 500. This value is more than 5. So I'm going to round up and I'm going to end up with 18,000 to the nearest 1,000. Here again, we are more than 500. This number here is more than 5. So we're going to round up to 89,000. And this number here, this final value here is 5. And 5 or more we round up. So it's going to end up with 2,000 at the end. Okay, for the orange box for decimal places, this first one here has been rounded to 1, 2, 3 decimal places. The second one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 decimal places. And the final one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So for decimal places, we are only worried about the number after the point. And we count every single one, even if it is a 0. Okay, and even if it's a 0 at the end as well, if they put it in there, you count it. Significant figures are a little bit different, and we count every single one of the figures for significant figures. So in this first one, it's been rounded to 1, 2, because we count before the point as well, 3, 4, 5 significant figures. The second one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 significant figures. Now this last one is a little bit different. If there are zeros ahead, we don't count them. And it's the same if you are rounding to a certain number of significant figures. You do not include zeros. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros that we're not going to include. It is only these figures here that we're interested in. So this one has actually been rounded to 4 significant figures. And that's the importance of significant. Because if we were to count these zeros, and I said round this value to 4 significant figures, it would actually be 0, 0, 0, 0. So it wouldn't tell you anything about the number. So it's really important that we don't include these zeros here. Okay. So why do we bother with making approximations? This is what we're doing when we round things. We're making approximations. There's a few reasons why we might want to do this. So the first thing would be that the exact values of our measurements may not be known. So you might be using an instrument which only reaches a certain measurement. I don't know why that's been cut off at the end. So for example here, I've got my centimetre ruler and it tells me every millimetre, but it doesn't tell me anything less than a millimetre. So every time I'm using a ruler to measure in centimetres and millimetres, I'm making an approximation. I'm approximating whether something is closer to, for example, 5 millimetres or 4 millimetres. So we are rounding to the nearest millimetre in this case. We might also make an approximation when we don't need an exact value. For example, I might say India's population is about, what's this? 1/800 billion, yeah. And we may be thinking about an average value that's taken from many measurements. For example, I might take several apples and I might approximate their weight to 250 grams. But I can't say that every apple on Earth weighs 250 grams because that wouldn't be true. But approximately, that is how much an average apple weighs. So all of these are reasons for making approximations. So, some rules for rounding. If you round to the nearest 10, your answer should be a multiple of 10. You should have 1 0 at the end, at least. If you're rounding to the nearest 100, your answer should be a multiple of 100 and you're looking for 2 zeros at the end. And rounding to the nearest 1,000, your answer should be a multiple of 1,000 and have 3 zeros at the end. If you're rounding to a certain decimal place, so for instance in this case we're rounding to 1 decimal place, you look at the figure before the one that you're interested in. So 1 decimal place, I'm interested in this figure here. We look at the one before. If it's less than 5, we round down. If it's 5 or above, we round up. So in this case, this would be 0.7. In this case, it would be 0.8. If I'm rounding to significant figures, for example, 3 significant figures, remember in this one, I don't count these 2 zeros. So 1, 2, 3. And I'm interested in what this number here is after my 3 significant figures. So it's a 5, so I'm going to need to round up, and here it's a 2, so I'm going to need to round down. So in this case I end up with 0.0744, and in this case I get 0.0743. So be careful with what figures you're looking at. So you work out how many significant figures you want, 1, 2, 3, and then you look at the number after that. Okay, your turn. I'd like you to make the following measurements and report the results in the various ways that I'm asking you to. So the first one is I want you to measure the length of your leg in centimetres. I'd like you to do it first of all to the nearest 10 centimetres. Well, first of all, I'd like you to just write down what it is. Then I'd like you to write it to the nearest 10 centimetres and then to the nearest 1 decimal place. So you're going to need to include millimetres in this. And then I'd like you to pick a plant in the courtyard. I'd like you to write down its height in centimetres. Then I'd like you to measure it to the nearest 1 centimetre and then to 2 significant figures. And then finally I'd like you to measure the length of the tennis court, first the nearest 100 centimetres and then to 4 significant figures. And I want you to think about the final part of question 3, because it might be a little bit tricky. I've given you a trundle wheel to measure the tennis courts. So you need to think about how a trundle wheel works and the fact that you need to be answering to the nearest to 4 significant figures. So you need to work out how you are going to manage that. Okay, off you go.